Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Hennessy. It's a great pleasure to preside over MEG61 with Chris Andrew talking about his new official history on MI5. Authorised history, I beg your pardon, slight difference. But before we get to the main event of the night, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Hewlett Packard and Tribal Consulting, who look after the mining group as if we were their children. And I'd like to invite James Johns of Hewlett Packard to come up and say a few words before we kick off.
Thanks very much, Peter. We don't normally speak at violent groups, largely because we can't find our notes. Largely because we're slightly wiser than to try and either follow or precede the fantastic speakers that we have here, but we did want to make an exception to that. Many regular attendees at the violent group will have known Charles Cox. And for those of you who didn't, Charles used to be the managing director of our government business in the UK. And it was Charles who was the real driver behind our relationship with Peter and the mining group. Unfortunately, almost exactly 2 years ago now, Charles was the victim of an assault which left him seriously injured. And it was immediately after that that I first got involved in MEG and had to wade through the paperwork and the collection of emails that Charles had put together. Because inevitably, as was always the case with Charles, the details weren't written down. They were all still in his head along with a million other ideas. What was clear from the papers that I picked up was that Charles had a vision about our relationship with the mining group that was beyond it being simply a straightforward business relationship, a straightforward sponsorship. He had a belief that working closely with government, as we do, brings with it a wider responsibility, and that whilst we profit from the contracts we do with government, clearly, we also have a duty to put something back. And I think that the vision that Charles had for our relationship with the mining group, that putting something back, was about helping to contribute to maintaining the corporate memory of some of our public bodies and to support those who choose to make it the focus of their careers and their studies. Part of the funding that we give to the mining group is used to provide bursaries for students here at Queen Mary. And I think it's a fantastic reflection of what I know Charles wanted to achieve through that sponsorship, that there were so many of them, the alumni from those bursaries here tonight. And I can see a few of them in the audience, James, Will, Simon and others. Sadly, Charles passed away earlier this summer as a result of the injuries he suffered when he was assaulted, and this is the first MEG since then. His colleagues at HP, formerly EDS, were keen to mark this, and we wanted to do it in a way that would have meant something to Charles, that Charles would appreciate it. So we've decided to rename the bursaries that we provide to MEG students in Charles's memory, and I'm absolutely delighted that the first 3 recipients of the Charles Cox bursaries are here tonight. It's Michelle Mansfield, Charlene Brennan, and Sarah Taylor. And really, I just want to finish by asking you to join me in wishing these students and their predecessors the best of luck with their studies and their future careers. And if you could just take a moment to remember Charles Cox, I know his colleagues at EDS would appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. I'd like to add my warm appreciation of what Charles did for us. He's a wonderful man. It's a great evening for me. I've been looking forward to this for years, because Chris and I have known each other for 48 years and 6 months. I first saw him across Harry Hinckley's room in St John's College, Cambridge, shuddering with piles of books, remnants of Harvey's Bristol cream going back to Lovely Speaking 1946, when George Kennan, great George Kennan, came to the seminar, and Chris was sporting, slightly looked. Still going to look, actually. One of the first blue corduroy jackets Cambridge had seen. Given that we were children of rationing and not quite the Brits, almost, you know, a real dandy, I thought. The next time I met him, I came as a set of exam scripts to the History Faculty Part 2, and he came as an examiner. But we didn't meet properly until a few years later. And then, a few years after that, on the Times, in the old days, and it was still a quality newspaper, we formed an alliance, collusion, the best sense, not the Anthony sort of collusion, this was benign collusion. And he wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, I think, calling for a degree of oversight of British intelligence, which was treated as if he'd made an unfortunate remark about Her Majesty the Queen, extremely badly. And I wrote it all up in the Times with a picture of him, and he still had his looks. And from then on, we've collaborated as friends and colleagues and historians. But in the early 80s, Professor Sir Henry Hinckley is a great man, the official historian of British intelligence in World War II, who taught both of us, took us on one side separately, my boys, he said, because he had a sort of church-Indian accent. My boys, he said, my boy. Do you realise if you and Chris Andrew carry on like this, you will be put away under Section 1 of the Official Secrets Act, Section 1, Section 2. And I said, well, we're only trying to help Harry, which didn't persuade him at all. And I said, but you will be a character witness in the Old Bailey, won't you? Of course I will, my boy. But it didn't come to that. But I do think that if the incomparable Harry were with us tonight, A, he wouldn't believe this was out, and B, he certainly would not do it, much as he was loyal to his old boys. But this is a terrific book. There's real gold between these covers. All sorts of things that we didn't know, in fact shouldn't have known until now. And also, because this is a scholarly gathering, there's real gold in here for future PhD theses and master's theses. There's all sorts of things that can come out of this, particularly if MI5, as I hope, puts successive tranches of documents in the National Archives, now that the official history is out. The plan this evening is for Chris to talk for about half an hour, and in the sofa style, which we now adopt, Queen Anne, I shall ask him a couple of questions while you think of yours, and then it will be a free-for-all. Chris is on the record during his initial presentation, but the Q&A is Chatham House, so indiscretion can break out across the entire room. Chris, you're very welcome.
Wouldn't it be extraordinary if Peter and I were both to be taken away immediately after the end of the evening? But for those who are contemplating that, I hope that they will wait for me to say what I have to say, and for Peter and I to engage in subversive discussion afterwards. This is the most self-serving picture I dare to hazard a guess that any speaker at the Myland group has dared to use as the introduction for their talk. I have two excuses for doing so, neither of them particularly good. But there's a Cambridge historian, toward myself, about to go into MI5 headquarters, and by the way, the first photograph, I think, of anybody going into MI5 headquarters. I heard myself saying at a press conference immediately after the book came out that I was the first Cambridge first historian to be allowed access to MI5 archives without restriction. That is true, but I'm not the first Cambridge historian to take an active interest in MI5 archives. The first one was an art historian. His name was Anthony Blunt. And I think in many ways he epitomises the different approaches of Queen Mary's College and Cambridge University towards intelligence studies. Queen Mary's graduates, in my experience, go into the intelligence services of our own side. There's nothing wrong with it, and I believe that perhaps Cambridge could even learn from it. It is necessary to draw your attention that Cambridge does have a more cosmopolitan, perhaps more deplorable tradition. We have sent our best graduates into the intelligence services of both sides. And now for the second reason for using this preposterously self-serving photograph. What I was didn't occur to me when the job was advertised and I got the job, that I would be invited to become a member of the security service while I was writing the book. I wouldn't have suggested that, but with the gift of hindsight, I actually think it was quite a good idea, and you may well disagree, and are fully entitled to disagree during the questions. But here's the reason. It really doesn't matter what the organisation is, whether it's QMW or MI5. If you are a member of the organisation, people will talk to you in a way that they will not if you're an interloper. And the only way, I think, to have any chance of picking up the culture of the organisation, how could one possibly write about any organisation without having some sense of the culture, is to be a part of it. So one of the things that has fascinated me while I've been writing this history is A, MI5 self-image, and secondly, how it sees its self-image differently from SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. Well, I've quoted in the book a document from 1995 in which, for the first time, MI5 seeks to sum up its culture and that of SIS. And this is what it says. SIS has a culture that attracts greatest importance to individual achievements in operational work. Officers are required to be independent self-starters to operate effectively in small overseas stations in potentially or actually hostile environments. Whereas security service, general intelligence duties officers, tend to be team players, SIS intelligence branch officers are more likely to have a fighter pilot mentality. Well, I beg to disagree. There have been a few fighter pilots in MI5, and I'm about to show you the kind of fighter pilot that not even SIS has been able to produce. I think. Yes, there we are. SIS can't do that. The security service can, although not frequently. Our most adventurous agent before the Second World War was somebody who was appropriately called the Mad Major, appropriately because he was in fact mad, and B because he was in fact a major. His name was Christopher Draper, and he flew under every bridge in London. His favourite was Tower Bridge, that's of course the easy one, under certain circumstances. But he caught the attention of a foreign aviator fanatic. That's it. The man on the right is Adolf Hitler. The Mad Major is on the left, and two insignificant German fighter races from the First World War are separating the two. And so, after Adolf had spoken to Arman at length at a Munich air show, when he got back, he was asked if he would provide intelligence on the Royal Air Force for the outfit. And he said, I'd be only too happy. And he only stopped to ask MI5 if that would be okay. And MI5 said it would be perfectly okay, provided he only provided the intelligence which was approved by MI5. Now, this is not merely a James Bond story. And James Bond never, by the way, attempted to fly under all London bridges, so this is the story of James Bond's Bond. But he does explain the beginning of the most extraordinary success that MI5 has ever achieved, which is the double-cross system during the Second World War, in which every German spy, most people, I think most of you know this already, every German spy who was landed in Britain during the Second World War was captured, and the best of them were turned around into double agents who exercised the most successful deception in the entire history of warfare, in the disinformation they passed back to the German High Command and to Adolf Hitler. But what's not been clear is how it was that MI5 knew the addresses and the PO boxes to monitor. The reason that they did from the beginning of the Second World War, the eve of the Second World War, was simply by monitoring the addresses that the Mad Major was supposed to contact his affair controllers with. Now, that kind of thing doesn't begin in one war. The only reason I think that the security service was able to run a system of deception as successful as that one is that it had done so to a lesser extent in the First World War. So, as with most things in the Second World War, you can't possibly explain the success of the perpetrators of Bletchley Park without paying attention to the success of lesser success, but important prefiguring of the success in the Second World War, without looking backwards. So here's the MI5 First World War predecessor. MI5 at the outbreak of the First World War only numbered 17 people, and the 17 included the caretaker. One of the first people who they recruited is this man, William Hinchley Cook, recruited at the age of only 20 in August 1940. He had a British father, he had a German mother, he was educated in Germany, he was bilingual but spoke English with a strong German accent. At the beginning of the Second World War, even people who owned accents were in trouble. Anyone who attempted to enter the war office speaking with a strong German accent would not have got in unless, yes, you can see it at the bottom, Vernon Kell, the first Director General of MI5, writes at the bottom, "He is an Englishman." Or Englishman, as it's called. But he was also a bogus Prussian officer. And every prisoner of war he went up to, none of them doubted that he was a prisoner of war like then. but he was also an enemy alien, and so certified by the Metropolitan Police. Note that it's precisely the same picture. He's simply given a different name, Wilhelm Eduard Koch. Now for our founder. Now, it's difficult for most of the photographs of Vernon Keller, who was the founder of the first head of MI5 in 1909, to realise that he was the youngest head when he was appointed of any British intelligence agency in modern times. It's also difficult, I think, looking at him, because he looks pretty unassuming, and in most ways he was unassuming. He was probably the best linguist ever to head any British government organisation, certainly any British intelligence agency. In 1909, when he joined, he had translator's qualifications in Chinese, translator qualifications in Russian, and he spoke all the obvious German, French and other European languages that we speak. So he was an extraordinary individual. I think the point which I realised for the first time how extraordinary he was in the aftermath of the Munich crisis. He was not an extrovert. The nearest he came to extroversion was publishing an article on the behaviour of the lapwing, which is not tremendously extroverted. But after providing Neville Chamberlain before me with a closely reasoned argument based on intelligence gained from inside the German embassy in London, that appeasement would only encourage Adolf Hitler, and it failing to make any impact, he then had to decide the most difficult question that I think an intelligence chief has to decide in any country, at any time, and in any place. How do you tell truth to a power that does not want to listen? Well, there is one technique. There has yet, I believe, to be a major policymaker born who failed to pay attention to a report that his or her main opponents regularly insulted them. So, this deeply introverted individual wrote, I think, the most extraordinary document ever written to a British Prime Minister by an intelligence chief. He decided to tell Neville Chamberlain that Adolf Hitler, based on the intelligence they were receiving, regularly referred to him as an arsehole. And he put the word in German as well. This was passed by the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, who was very well brought up and had not seen the word in print before. So, underlined it 3 times in red. Telling truth to power has never been as exciting since in modern British history, to my almost certain knowledge. Now, this is the Myland Group, so I want to raise some policy issues. The next policy issue that I want to raise is gender history. Oh yes, I haven't got time for that, except simply to point out that MI5 Christmas cards were damn sight better in 1917, nearly 1918 than they are now. You'll be lucky to get a picture of Thames House with a little bit of holly on the left-hand corner and a robin on the right-hand corner. The main point to make about this Christmas card, and by the way, how do we know it's MI5? Easy. Masked Britannia, and look at the bottom of her trident, MI Roman V. That's what MI5 was all about in those days. Really interesting Christmas cards. And the bottom left-hand corner, there you can't see it, it's got EHW INV. It was thought to be really very cool in those days to use Latin abbreviations. EHW Invading. Eric Holt Wilson, Deputy DG of MI5, designed it. Bottom right-hand corner, Byam Shaw Dell, Byam Shaw Delixit, Byam Shaw drew this. So, MI5 gave an extraordinary amount of thought to the Christmas cards it sent, because if it sent the most interesting Christmas card in Whitehall, which it did, then that would impress people and convey its image. It's done very well now. Right. What I think no gender historian has noticed, no women's historian has noticed, even though the evidence has been in the public domain for a long time, is that the glass ceiling was first cracked in MI5 and first broken in MI5. As the evidence has been in the public domain, for an awful long time. Well, obviously, Stella Remington becoming the first female head of any of the world's major intelligence agencies, and not a woman who was picked out from an otherwise almost wholly male group, like, for example, Margaret Thatcher. 40% of the officers of MI5 at the moment when she was chosen as DG in 1992 were women. And the fact that Eliza Manningham-Buller, now Baroness Manningham-Buller in the House of Lords, was chosen as the next but one, indicates that there is an area that I think is worth gender historians paying attention to. Where does it begin? It begins in the First World War. Why does it begin in the First World War? It was the men in the First World War, when MI5 increased rapidly from 17 people, including the caretaker, to 870. Most of them were there because they couldn't fight on the Western Front because they'd been wounded and so on and so on. But they had the brilliant idea, for the first time in British history, of having the cleverest secretaries in British history. So what did they do? First of all, they looked towards the upper orders. So because it was assumed, understandably, that those who lived in 2 up and 2 down houses would not have had the opportunity to learn how to keep confidences. And then they went to Oxford colleges, to Oxford Women's Colleges, Royal Holloway, which was then a women's college, and to Cheltenham Ladies' College. And so what happened? Time after time, pictures like this. The caption on the picture, which was during the First World War, is "Miss thinks she's right." The area where the clever women were more frequently correct than the not quite so clever and not quite so well-bred men were in the accounts. And therefore, it's in MI5 that the first female financial controller in British history, Miss Masterton, she was perhaps appropriately called, begins her career. One other example, 1916, most secretaries were not like this. 1916, a secretary called Jane Sismore joins at the age of only 16, direct from school. 8 years later, in 1924, she has qualified in her spare time as a barrister, but she is also head of the Soviet department of MI5 at a time when the Soviet Union was the most important target for British intelligence. That couldn't have happened in the Foreign Office. It couldn't have happened in Cambridge University. It couldn't have happened in London University. There is a huge and interesting agenda for women's historians and gender historians, I think. Yes, well, reviews in MI5 still go on. I wouldn't resist, I wouldn't deny that I take part in them, but that could perhaps be better left until we move on to the record. Oh, that is the now 24-year-old secretary, Jane Sismore, who had joined in 1914. Now, because this is my own group, I want to move on to some policy issues rather than simply what I find the fascinating byways and indeed main pathways of MI5 history. So let me begin to seek to raise some policy issues by quoting Sherman Kent, the founding father of US intelligence analysis, arguably the founding father of intelligence analysis in the world. He complains in 1955 that intelligence was the only profession which lacked a serious literature. And he says this: "From my point of view, this is a matter of greatest importance. As long as this discipline lacks a literature, its methods, its vocabulary, its body of doctrine, even its fundamental theory, run the risk of never reaching full maturity." End of quotation. Practicing economists, practicing politicians, amongst others, are rightly critical of the remoteness of some academic research from the real world in which they operate, but not so, of course, in Peter's case. But economics without economic theory and economic history, politics without political history, and occasionally without political science, would be what Kent forecast intelligence would remain without an intelligence literature, immature discipline. So intelligence communities developed during the Cold War without any real conceptual understanding of what they were about, and without any real understanding also of what their past record had been. And that is why intelligence, even today, is the only profession anywhere in the world in which a fictional character is at least 100 times better known than anyone who ever really practiced the art. Obviously, James Bond. It's important to realise that James Bond gives British intelligence a certain advantage because we are the brand leader. I now quote a friend of Peter and myself who used to be head of one of the intelligence agencies. And he has described to me, and I think to Peter, how as a young officer, he went to the depths of the Third World and interviewed in the national interest, no doubt, the tribal chief. And he assumed the tribal chief knew no English. Well, no doubt he was more or less right. But the tribal chief did know one sentence of English, which may well be known to a majority of the world's population. And he greeted our man with it. And the sentence with which he greeted him was, "Hello, Mr. Bond." Now, you see, if our lad had to say, "No, I'm sorry, it's been a bit of a mistake, it's the French DGSE," or "There's been an error in transmission, I'm the German BND," wouldn't really have worked. One shouldn't boast too much, but why not? You know, in Europe at any rate, we are Nike, and the competition is no brand. There are two other extremely well-known brands, one which is the KGB, which is extremely noxious, and the other one is the CIA, which is, of course, a deeply controversial brand. So, what has happened is that not merely intelligence communities, but arguably even more important, policymakers have grown up without any sense of what the past record of intelligence was. And if you don't understand the past record of anything, then you don't know really what it can do and what it can't do. You might be able to work out what it ought to do and what it ought not to do. So, you know, I've heard it said that we'll not comment in advance of the off the record that Tony Blair, as late as 1997, took office without any real interest in or understanding of intelligence. Obviously, I wouldn't comment on that. I've also heard it said that there was a miraculous transformation on 9/11, which led to a degree of sudden enthusiasm, which had consequences for later years. That again is a proposition that I would not wish to comment on personally just yet. In the United States, now I'm not necessarily right about it, not necessarily right about anything, but my book on American presidents is given to every new analyst in the CIA, so there's an element of plausibility about it. My conclusion was that there have been 4 presidents in over 200 years who actually understood what intelligence could do and what intelligence could not do. Not perfectly. They are George Washington, Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and Bush the other, but emphatically not the younger. Now, the problem, of course, if you leave a really important area of academic research virgin, is that it's not going to remain virgin. It's going to be polluted by conspiracy theorists and fantasists. And that is precisely what happens to intelligence in the middle of the Cold War. So every opinion poll, since around about 1970, has shown that a majority of Americans believe that the CIA was centrally involved in killing J.F. Kennedy. Anybody who believes that, in my judgment, there may be a mental health problem there, but there's certainly no problem, no possibility of understanding the real world of American intelligence. It doesn't mean to say that one should regard it as wholesome. If one thinks again of the kind of stories which in Britain, even in academic circles, have reached something like the status of conventional wisdom. The idea that MI5 plotted to bring down Harold Wilson. The idea that Sir Roger Hollis, for 9 years, the Director General of MI5, was actually working for the Soviet Union. One begins to see the problem. I think that the broader proposition is simply this, that it is widely believed, and I think to a degree I believed it, and so I started looking at the files. Throughout the Cold War, the security service was obsessed with finding Reds under beds, from time to time found Reds in beds, and attempted to persuade an indifferent government that they should pay attention to this. No, actually, it's usually the other way around. From, particularly during industrial disputes, from Attlee to Margaret Thatcher, and I may well be the first person to compare the two in QMW, and I wouldn't make any other comparison between the two. It's usually the government which is seeing more subversion behind industrial disputes, and it's actually the case, and usually the security service which is attempting to calm people, calm government down. Now, I'm about to race through a lot of interesting pictures, but I will hope to end with the right one in just a minute. All the other pictures are extremely interesting, and there is no time to talk about them. Now, here's a document from 1961 which appears to prove the point that the security service was obsessed with finding subversives, particularly in the Labour Party. So at the top you see Sir Roger Hollis, who was Director General of MI5 at the time. And the left-hand side you can see he headed Communist Party, CP Communist Party. 16 Labour MPs, who are believed to be first and foremost communists and simply using membership of the Labour Party as cover. And on the right-hand side, possible, another 9 names. But also notice that in the top right-hand corner, it says not MI5, it says House of Commons. This was the Labour leadership in 1961. Hugh Gaitskell, George Brown, and the messenger was the future Labour Foreign Secretary, Patrick Gordon Walker, asking MI5's view, help in working out what these people were up to. What MI5 did is usual, looking at a list like that, was simply to assume that the politicians who had got obsessed by this list were hyperventilating, but it did make and refused to help because it was part of politics. But it also, in private, wrote a number of memoranda saying that these people were no threat at all. But it did make one significant mistake. Wherever you're sitting, you may be able to see the name of the top left-hand corner, well, only in the front. It says W. Owen, Will Owen, MP for Morpeth. The Labour leadership knew at least one thing, which MI5 did not, which is that Will Owen may not have known that he was a Soviet bloc spy, but he had been working for Czechoslovak intelligence for 8 years at that point, and he carried on doing so for another 10 years. So there is at least one thing that Hugh Gaitskell and George Brown and Patrick Gordon Walker knew that MI5 did not. Now, let me move on to another, I think, policy issue. What does it matter if a security service does not know its own history? What does it matter if the security service does not take a long view? Well, in my judgment, it matters really rather a lot. First of all, take the long view. My view is that the generation in which we live, because we understand more than any previous generation, has also shown a level of hubris towards the experience of all previous generations, which no previously recorded generation has shown. In order to get this through to colleagues in Cambridge who think only in acronyms, I've been driven to the extreme lengths of inventing an acronym. And here is the acronym HASDD, HASD, Historical Attention Span Deficit Disorder. My colleagues used to disagree me until the credit crunch and the subprime crisis, but since then, the joy of seeing bankers on the London Tube reading books with titles like 1929 and The Great Crash, we didn't see that until a couple of years. Right. What is the security service nowadays? Its main job is counterterrorism. When it was founded, it was solely to do with counterespionage. Nowadays, only 3.5% of its resources go to counterespionage. It's concerned with counterterrorism. And latterly, it would be possible to argue, but I haven't left myself the time to argue, that it's done a pretty good job. It would have done an even better job if it had understood its past history. So let me give a few examples. I'm going to try to see if I can come out of the right picture, but I'm not sure if I can. These are astonishingly interesting pictures. Yeah, and we keep pretty fit in MI5. That's one. Now, time after time, one hears it said, one reads it said, that MI5 is peculiarly prejudiced about Muslims. If MI5 had known its own history and had been able to remember its own history, it would have had a crushing reply to that. The only ethnic group represented in Britain about which MI5 has been truly prejudiced is British Jews. After the Second World War, most of us know that the Menachem Begin, the Stone Gang, not the Stone Gang, and the Stone Gang, the last terrorist organisation in world history, by the way, to call itself a terrorist organisation, in order to accelerate the departure of the British mandate, first of all blew up its headquarters, the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing a number of people. They then got halfway to Britain and they blew up the Roman embassy. The only part of the wartime and pre-war Roman embassy that now survives is the stable block. And then what has got entirely forgotten is that an equally big bomb was actually planted in Whitehall by this woman, Betty Canute. She is effectively admitted it, but it failed to go off, and that has simply passed from the collective memory of Whitehall. For a quarter of a century afterwards, the security service, because it feared, quite wrongly, and question time on the reasons why I think it's quite wrong, refused to recruit Jews because it feared that they might suffer from dual loyalty. So that is the only ethnic group that the security service can be fairly accused of discriminating against. Now, the next one. That is Siobhan O'Hanlon, and I'll describe her career a little bit later. The second point, the second time which the security service became centrally involved in counterterrorism was, of course, during the Troubles. Troubles beginning in 1969, and it paid, so far as I can see, but again, this was par for the course within Whitehall, no attention whatever to the experience of the previous Troubles, in other words, the period from the Easter Rising of 1916 to the establishment of the Free State, now called the Irish Republic, in 1922. What happened during that period, 1916 to 1922? Well, if there had been the attempt to even to write, a few-page history, what would it have shown? It would have shown that military intelligence, army intelligence, had not got its act together. In particular, it was not cooperating with police intelligence, which had not got its act together, and police intelligence was not cooperating with it. It would also have shown that MI5 and SIS had no clearly defined role in North Ireland. Now, what happened in the 1970s? Exactly the same. It's one of, I think, the most striking examples of the proposition that those who do not understand past mistakes are doomed to repeat them. But that this broader confusion, which is still very little understood, here was the position during the 1970s and the 1980s. The security service had the lead intelligence role in dealing with terrorist threats to Britain from anywhere in the world, with just one exception. Unfortunately, it was the only exception then that truly mattered. In other words, Irish republicanism. Why? Because in 1883, when the Fenians began the dynamite war in London, hitting a lot of targets but not doing anything like the amount of damage they did later, the special branch of the Metropolitan Police, then called the Special Irish Branch, was founded in Whitehall. What you have, you hold. And so the absurd position arose that if the IRA attacked a British garrison abroad, then the security service had the lead role. If it attacked a British garrison in mainland Britain, it did not have the lead role. And that is why the biggest deployment of MI5 against the IRA in the 1970s and 1980s occurred not in Britain, let alone Northern Ireland. No, it occurred in Gibraltar. Siobhan O'Hanlon was a member of the IRA Active Service Unit, and what she's engaged there, monitored by A4, the surveillance branch of the security service is the attempt to blow up one of the softest British military targets anywhere, this target. The Gibraltar garrison, which obligingly engaged in change the guard ceremonies once a week. And throughout her period there, she was monitored on a daily basis. This is the movements on Saturday the 20th of February 1988. What impressed A4 was that she believed in the justice of her cause. She went into the Roman Catholic Cathedral. Actually, that was the next day, on the Sunday. She lit a candle, she said prayer. She, even though homicidal in her intention, she nonetheless inspired a degree of respect. And then finally, this is the last example that I've let myself time to talk about. The security service, even though my own judgment, which I would be prepared to defend at this time, has done a pretty remarkable job against Islamist terrorism in Britain in the 21st century, was slow to catch on to it. But so was everybody else. Why? Well, I think that it's a mixture of historical attention span deficit disorder, plus, you know, the silliest thing said by any advisor to Tony Blair, and there, of course, enormous competition for that. But I would say we don't do God is pretty silly, particularly the Prime Minister, who was already known was going to convert to Catholicism pretty soon after he... Why? Because actually the most dangerous terrorist opponents that this country was clear was already facing were religiously inspired. Now, this is an area, it seems to me, in which Whitehall moved dramatically backwards since the period since the Second World War. Actually, you know, it was regarded as extremely important to understand the ideological basis of Marxism. It was regarded as extremely important to understand the ideological basis of Marxism-Leninism. Even after the catastrophic failure to understand the fall of the Shah, amongst the most recent documents to be declassified at Kew are the reports by Tony Parsons, months before the Shah is overthrown, and he, after all, was an extremely capable diplomat, and believing that the Shah was solidly established on his thing. Why? Because the idea that an aging cleric could possibly lead a people's revolution with a level of enthusiasm not shown anywhere else in the world at that particular point for any political movement was beyond our imagination. So what British intelligence, what Whitehall needed desperately, and possibly us, the Americans as well, was theologians. But the idea of recruiting to a secular organisation in Britain theologians was just beyond anybody's imagination. Now, not everyone's imagination, however, because the few people who got it right were people who took a very long-term view, and in particular, well, obviously Bernard Lewis, so far as the fall of the Shah is concerned. But in the middle of the 1990s, Bruce Hoffman, who argued that the main security threat of the 21st century was going to be what he called holy terror, and so it was. Now, I got it right, but the only reason that I got it right is that I realised that Bruce Hoffman was right. The only independent judgment that I can claim to have shown is that when Bruce, before on the eve of 9/11, began to wonder whether he was wholly right and only became, I think, an 85% Hoffmanite, I was still 100% Hoffmanite. Now, the following is self-serving, and I just copied Bruce, but still, the problem about anybody making the kind of argument that I'm making is that they're going to be accused of getting it right after the event. So forgive me if I quote what I wrote before 9/11. The nature of the current terrorist threat has been widely misunderstood because it has been seen in too short-term a perspective. For the past generation, the conventional wisdom has been that the terrorist crime objective is publicity rather than victims, to terrify rather than to kill. This late 20th century variety of terrorism, however, is simply a short-term deviation from a much more dangerous long-term terrorist tradition, which is now reasserting itself. As Bruce Hoffman has argued, historically, most terrorism has been far more concerned to kill than to terrify. Until the 19th century, terrorism was essentially holy terror. Over the last 20 years, there's been a resurgence of traditional religious and cult-based terrorism, whose aims are epitomised by the words of the former Hezbollah leader, Hossein Masali. We are not fighting so the enemy will offer us something, we're fighting to wipe out the enemy. That was the ideology of the religious wars in early modern Europe. That is also the ideology, amongst others, of Osama bin Laden. If bin Laden possessed weapons of mass destruction, he would probably already have used them. Indeed, bin Laden declared in 1998 that acquiring WOD is a religious duty. I don't want to end on too pessimistic a note, but that is, of course, the future. The first person to plan to use weapons of mass destruction, a dirty bomb, against a British target, is Dhiren Barrett, a Hindu convert to Islamism in 2004. Now, there are only two possibilities. One is that he's going to be the last person in British history to attempt to explode a dirty bomb in Britain, although fortunately they've got very close to it. And the other option is that he won't be the last, and that, of course, is the option. I mean, the great challenge of the future is that we're just beginning to move into an age when Islamist terrorism will be getting far closer than Dhiren Barrett did to weapons of mass destruction. It's time for me to start, and for Peter to say something more cheerful than I've been saying.